If you would be opening your Bibles this morning to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. And last week we left off at the end of the thought that concludes there in verse 25. So we're going to pick up in verse 25 with our study this morning. Matthew chapter 26. Verse 25. David Lemons, would you lead our prayer to start us today?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you, Lord, so much for this time and hope we have to come together, Lord, to study more about thy word, but most of all, Lord, to worship thee today. I ask thee, Lord, that the things that Josh has prepared and the things that we study and the things that we say be in accordance with thy will and that we all may learn from this and put this to our everyday life. Ask thee, Lord, to go with us, guide and direct us. This prayer in Christ's name.
Amen. Well, in Matthew chapter 26, Jesus has gathered together with his disciples. They've gone into an upper room, and there they are preparing to observe the Passover feast. And while they are sitting there at the table, as we saw last week, Jesus brought up the issue that one of those sitting there around that table with him was going to be the one that was going to betray him. Well, of course, as the text says, they began to all go around the table. Is it I? Am I the one that's going to do this? Which that reveals to me that most of these individuals believed that that was something that they would never be capable of. And I think that we all can identify with that to a degree, because how many times have we found ourselves after we've slipped up and said something we didn't need to say or did something we didn't need to do, we look back and we think, I never thought I would do that. I never thought that was something that I would succumb to. And the fact of the matter is, because as children of God, we develop this mindset that we don't think about committing sin. We don't think of ourselves as being capable of committing sin, because we are focused upon serving the Lord, doing His will. Well, these individuals, they were looking at this fact that they've been with Jesus all along. They've been traveling with Him for about 3 years. They've not left His side, and now Jesus is saying, one of you, one of my closest friends, you're going to be the one to turn me over to the authorities. You're going to be the one to betray me. Well, like it says, they're all asking, well, is it me? Am I the one that's going to do this? They were all wondering. Well, you look at what the text says whenever we come to verse 25. They've gone around the table, or at least that's the picture that I see. They've gone around the table, and it finally comes to Judas. Well, remember, at this point, Judas has already gone and talked to the chief priests. He's already received his 30 pieces of silver. He's already been trying to find a good, opportune time where Jesus can be arrested. Well, verse 25 says, Then Judas, which betrayed him, answered and said, Master, is it I? Once again, and we talked about this a little last week, imagine the audacity of this man. Knowing what he was planning, knowing that in a sense he had already betrayed Jesus by going and accepting this blood money, but he had the audacity to sit there and look at Jesus and say, Jesus, am I the one that's going to do this? Well, Jesus answered. King James says, Thou hast said. One of the modern translations puts it this way. It says, Yes, it is you. Now, I've often wondered, did the other disciples hear him say that?
That's what I've wondered.
Because, at least in my mind, by my human reasoning, if those other disciples heard Jesus say, Judas, you're the one that's going to do this, it looks to me like that they would have taken some kind of action. But on the other hand, you've got to remember, and as we're going to see this in these next few verses, there's not a single one of them that claims they're ever going to leave Jesus. There's not a single one that claims they're ever going to turn their back on Him. And so it kind of makes me wonder also, are they thinking, well, Jesus may be mistaken, or was this something that Jesus said to Judas in private? We don't know. But what we do know is that Jesus acknowledged with 100% certainty that He knew that Judas was the one that was going to carry this out. Now, whether the other disciples knew at this point, we don't know. We know eventually they found out because it's recorded in the gospel accounts. But whether they knew at this point who it was, notice that Jesus never responds, at least in the text, He never responds to any of these other disciples when they're asking, is it I? Am I the one that's going to do this? The only one that this text says that Jesus responded to was Judas. And He says, yes, it is you. Thou hast said it. You're the one that's going to do this. Yes, sir.
And we're all sitting at the table eating.
Yeah, they were there. They were surrounding that table. There could have been a lot of conversation taking place. It could have been that each one was coming to Jesus in private saying, hey, am I the one that's going to do this? We don't know the exact detail of how that happened, but what we do know from this is Jesus already knew who it was that was going to betray Him. And He lets Judas know. He says, yes. He says, you are the one. Well, Judas, in my opinion, Judas was just going along with the crowd in this instance. Because Judas already knew that he was the one that was going to betray Him, because he had already put it in motion with the chief priests. And so when he sees all of the other disciples asking, well, is it me? Is it me? Is it me? More than likely the thought that popped into his head, well, if I don't go and ask Jesus, that's going to throw up some red flags. That's going to make people think that it's me. So he asked Jesus, and Jesus says, yeah, I know it's you. You're the one that's going to do this. But then you notice immediately after this, He goes into the institution of the Lord's Supper. He's told Judas, He says, yes, you're the one that's going to do this. Now, there are a couple of commentaries that I looked at, and there's nothing from the text that indicates that this is what happened. But I know also some of the, and you can't really put a lot of stock in this, but some of the Hollywood adaptations of this story as well, and some Jewish historians record as well, that after Jesus told Judas, yes, you're the one that did this, there's some indication that Judas may have got up and left at that point. That he didn't want to stay there. He didn't want to be in that company any longer. Now, as I said, there's nothing in the biblical text to indicate that, but there are some Jewish historians that record that that is what happened. There's some traditions that indicate that's what happened, so that could be the case. It could be that once it sank in to Judas that Jesus knows I'm the one that's going to do this, that he immediately left and went to the chief priests to try to get that set up. Because we know that it wasn't very long after that. After this observance of the Passover, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. There He went to a garden known as Gethsemane, and there He prayed. And that's where He would be arrested. But needless to say, whether that is reality or whether that is just tradition, we don't know. But what we do know is that Judas, from this point forward, he knew Jesus knows what's going to happen. He knows that I'm the one that's going to carry this out. And so whether Judas stuck around for the rest of the Passover, whether he was there for the institution of the Lord's Supper, we can't say with exact certainty. But we do know that it was at this point that Jesus revealed, I know who's going to betray me. I know that you're the one. Well, moving down into verse 26, and if you look at the three gospel accounts that record this instance, this institution of the Lord's Supper, we find the description just slightly different, at least in wording, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's accounts. But we find that the actual information of what was taking place is true. It is congruent with each other. So we're going to continue in Matthew's account. Verse 26 says, "And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples and said, 'Take, eat. This is my body.'" So while they're sitting there, they're eating the Passover feast. And one thing that was a part of the Passover feast, I shared with you last week that several years ago, Christy and I had an opportunity to go to a mock Passover feast and watch how that would have been done. It was very interesting, very eye-opening, the way that the Jews observed the Passover. But at the Passover feast, there would be a host of the party, a host of the occasion. And from the text, it would indicate here that Jesus is the one that was the host. You know, we often think in our society of the patriarch of the family sitting at the head of the table. He's the one that gets the meal started. Well, that's kind of what you had with the Passover. You had generally whoever the patriarch or the oldest one in the family would have been. Well, in this instance, this was the teacher and his disciples. So, of course, the teacher was the one that was carrying out each of these tasks. But during the Passover feast, occasionally there would be times when the feast would stop and the host would stand up and he would take a certain item off the table. And he would hold up that item and he would describe what that item was symbolic of. And then after describing all of that, then each person around that table would take their portion of that item. And generally, each person would already have a small portion of each one of these things in front of them. And they would commune together. They would take whatever that item was. On drinks, there would be some goblets filled with water. There would be some that would have wine. And each one of these would be indicative of different things. There would be roasted lamb that was symbolic. There would be bread. And one thing that was, in a sense was funny, but in a sense wasn't, there was a portion of the Passover feast where a bitter herb was to be partaken of. Well, the one that was hosting this event, they didn't tell us what that white substance was on the table in front of us. They just told us that it was time to partake of this bitter herb. Well, what it was a big dollop of straight horseradish. Well, those of us that didn't know, we just popped the whole thing in our mouth. Well, you can imagine it was pretty rough for a few minutes there. Now, exactly what that herb would have been that they would have used in that society, we don't know, but it was this concept of a bitter herb. And the person that was teaching the class went on to describe that the bitter herb was indication of the suffering that they had endured in Egypt and the bitterness that was there because of the slavery and the bondage, everything they went through. And so everything was symbolic. So we see they're observing this Passover, and Jesus is taking them through each one of these steps. Well, he comes to a point in this meal where he stops and he takes bread. He holds up this bread and he says something different than what would have commonly be said during the Passover. He takes this bread and he blessed it, he broke it, and he said, "This is my body." My body. Now, during the Passover, the bread was indicative of the manna that fell from heaven. And so the host would always tell the story about manna falling from heaven, God providing that sustenance for the children of Israel. But Jesus didn't tell that story. Jesus didn't hold up that bread and talk about the manna. Jesus held it up. He said, "This is my body." Now, we need to understand that in that statement, Jesus was not saying, as some in the religious world around us believe, that that is literally Jesus' body. It was indicative of or symbolic of Jesus' body. There's two different ideologies that you have in that area. There's some that believe that when the priest prays over those emblems, before the prayer is offered, it's just bread. But then after the prayer is offered, that it literally becomes the human flesh of Jesus. There's another ideology that states that it remains bread until it enters into the mouth of a faithful Christian. When it enters the mouth of a faithful Christian, it literally becomes the flesh of Jesus. But if it enters the mouth of someone that is not faithful, then it just remains bread. There's nothing in the text that indicates that this is what Jesus had in mind at all. These were symbolic elements, just like those elements of the Passover were symbolic of things from Jewish history. These things are there to call the attention back to these elements. When we think about the bread, Jesus says, use this bread to remember my body that was broken for you. Now, there are some in the Lord's church today that also look at this passage and they say, well, in this, notice it says that literally in the Greek text, it says that he took a loaf of bread. They say, therefore, you're only to have a single loaf, that everyone is to partake of that single loaf. There's some, and I don't see where they get this argument. They say, well, that loaf is only to be broken as each individual Christian breaks their piece from that loaf. There's others among that ideology that say, well, no, you start with one loaf, but the text says that you bless it, then you break it, then you divide it. And so they say, well, you bless the bread, then you can break it into as many pieces and divide it as you need to. Well, once again, this is grasping at straws. It's trying to read something into the text that it's not saying. And also, whenever you remember the pattern of how the Passover feast was observed, each one of those men would have had a small loaf of bread in front of them. And the pattern was when the host stood up and described that object, each person then took the loaf that was before them, and they partook of that in that part of the feast. And so, rather than looking at that, and we'll look at this a little bit more when he talks about the fruit of the vine, the text is not saying that every person has to partake of the same literal loaf, but we are to have the understanding that it is all symbolic of the one body of Jesus that was hung on the cross for us. That's what this is talking about. It's talking about the symbolism. It's not talking about actually how many times the loaf gets broken. Now, there's some that take this so far to say that if we start out with one loaf and we've blessed that and we start passing it around, say it comes to Elton and Elton has a little bit of trouble and he accidentally breaks that loaf into two pieces, that you have to remove one of those pieces of that loaf because you have to continue on with just one single loaf. You see, people try to read things into the scriptures that aren't there. That's not what this is indicating at all. Each one of them would have partaken of their own portion that would have been on the table before them before the Passover ever began. But then continuing down into verse 27, it says, and he took the cup. Now in this, some look at this and they say, well, it says it took the cup, not the cups. Therefore, everybody is to drink out of one cup. Well, he took the cup and gave thanks, gave it to them, saying, drink ye all of it. One of the other gospel accounts, I believe it's Mark's account, says that he took it and he divided it among them all. Well, as I said, each one of them would have had, I believe it's 3 goblets of water and 3 goblets of fruit of the vine. That would be placed before them. That would have been symbolic of different things. Well, Jesus would have stood, he would have taken his, and he would have done as the pattern of the Passover was. He would have described what those things were. I know one of those was indicative of the blood of the Passover that was placed on the doorposts and on the mantle of the doors to the houses of the children of Israel. And just right off the top of my head, I can't remember what the other two were indicative of. But again, he stands up and he says something that was different from what typically would have been said in the Passover. He stands up, he takes that cup, he takes that fruit of the vine, and he says, "This is my blood." Again, this is not saying that the fruit of the vine literally becomes the blood of Jesus. It's not the way that it works. These are emblems. These are symbols of the things that he's talking about. And he says, "Take this and drink ye all of it. For this is my blood of the New Testament." Or I believe the American Standard says of the New Covenant. Well, folks, we know that when Jesus died on the cross, when his body was nailed there, those spikes driven through his hands and his feet, his body was broken. No, his bones were not broken. But we think about the holes in his hands. We think of the lacerations to his back from being beaten. His body was broken. That bread is indication to us, a reminder to us of his body. Now, the fruit of the vine, it's indicative of the blood that he shed on the cross. That blood ushered in the new covenant. You go to the book of Hebrews, and what does the book of Hebrews tell us is necessary in order for a new covenant to take effect? Without the shedding of blood, without the death of the testator, then the testament cannot come into effect. So in Jesus' death on the cross, notice what he says in verse 28. He says these things are emblematic of what is bringing about this new covenant. So when Jesus' body was nailed to the cross, when it was broken, when his blood was shed, that fulfilled that old covenant. And with the death of the testator, this new covenant, this New Testament came into establishment. He says, so whenever you observe these things, and I find it very interesting that in this, ultimately what he's saying is you're not going to be observing the Passover anymore. These emblems aren't going to have that same meaning. He said, but from now on when you come together, this bread is indicative of my body. This fruit of the vine is indicative of my blood. He said, you're not going to be worried about manna. You're not going to be thinking about the blood on the doorpost. He said, that's all from the past. That's all in the old covenant. Those were things that held symbolism to the children of Israel. He said, but now, he said, this is what I want you to remember. The fruit of the vine and the bread. And this is what it is indicative of. Any questions or comments up to this point? Yes, sir.
I have heard people, prior to that, he says it's fruit of the vine. I've heard people get up and pray, and once in a while they'll say wine, use the word wine. And I've done a research on this, and nowhere can I find that the word wine is used in relation to the Lord's Supper.
No.
It's fruit of the vine.
Right. Well, and where that originated, you look at the Greek language that was common at the time, that Koine Greek language that the New Testament's written in. There were actually 3 different Greek words that described what we know of as fruit of the vine. And there was one that was talking about that which is fermented, and most of the time, at least in the King James Version, that term is translated strong drink. Then you have another term, that's the most common term, and where it gets kind of confusing, that term is one that can be used to describe either that which has fermented naturally, it has not had any sugars added to it or anything to elevate the alcohol content, but that which has simply fermented due to the passing of time. But it can also be used to refer to what we might refer to today as fresh squeezed grape juice. And so you have to look at the context of what's taking place around it oftentimes to see what this would have been in reference to. Would this would have been that which is intoxicating, or would this have been that which was not intoxicating. But then there's a third term, and that term is used to refer to the juice that is still within the fruit, that has not been squeezed from the fruit yet. And oftentimes people want to look at Jesus' first miracle, the turning of the water to wine at the wedding feast of Cana. Guess which one of those Greek terms is used to describe that wine? Any idea?
Fresh, squeezed.
That which is still in the fruit,
On the fruit.
indicating that which would have been the freshest. And so what that context is saying is that, and of course using that term wine as used there, that wine would have been the freshest juice possible. As if it had just came out of the fruit. They squeezed it from the fruit directly into the glass. Now, a lot of people want to look at that passage and try to argue that that shows that social drinking is acceptable. Well, whenever you look at the context and you look at what we know about the nature of Jesus and you look at what we know about that term that is there translated, Jesus did not create intoxicating wine. But also another way to look at this, did Jesus ever do anything that presented a temptation to another person? No. Well, if he had created, and this would have been gallons and gallons of this beverage, if Jesus had created all of that, do you think that would have posed a temptation to anyone that was there? I'm sure it would have. But also, you look at that text, and I know we're moving away from the actual lesson text we're looking at here. You look at the lesson text, and what did the host of the party say when that glass was brought to him to test it?
Save the best.
He saved the best. Well, some try to argue, well, the best would have been that which had the highest alcohol content. No. In that culture, the best was that which was the sweetest, the freshest. And so he's saying, why did you keep back the very best? And now you're bringing that out now later on. And so there's so many indications there that show us that this would not have been the case. But also we have to keep in mind, and where some of this originates as well, in 1611, when the King James Version was translated, there were not separate designations in the English language for fermented wine or unfermented wine. It was just one term, wine. And so rather than the translators going through and presenting that differentiation in the text, they didn't do that because they didn't have to do that. Because the people understood, well, we have to look at the context of what's taking place. So going back to what Ed's saying, in what we see here in Matthew chapter 26, and there are still a few congregations of the Lord's church, I believe all of them that remain are down in Mississippi, but there are a few congregations of the Lord's church that believe that when you observe the Lord's Supper, it has to be with fermented wine. And they take that, as I said, because of a misunderstanding of the terminology there in the text. They don't look at the actual meaning of those words. But in this, the way I've heard it described best is that even in the culture of the day, with the Greek term that is used here in this passage referring to the fruit of the vine, even if it was that which had any alcoholic content whatsoever, it would have been that which had simply fermented naturally over time. And it would not have been such that was able to intoxicate someone. But to me, just from what I see in the context and what I know about the nature of Jesus, I don't believe that was the case. I believe that what we see here would have been very similar to what we saw at the wedding feast. It would have been the best. It would have been the freshest. Because the observances of these feasts were very special times. And people always tried to present their best. It's kind of like whenever we observe the holidays. You know, you go and you have Thanksgiving, which I know a lot of our families nowadays, we use paper plates and things like that because we don't want to have to clean up. But you go back even a generation ago, and what would have come out at Thanksgiving? The very best. What would have come out when you came together and had Christmas lunch? It would have been the very best you had. And so we kind of can understand where they're coming from. They would have set out the very best of what they had. But we're out of time. The bell just rang. So we're going to stop right there. And then, Lord willing, next Sunday we'll pick up in verse 29.